Welcome to this new Teach Out conversation. We are at Emory University in the company of Gabrielle Dudley. Hello, Gabrielle.
Hi.
Tell us, where are we?
So currently we're in the Stuart A. Manuscript Archive and Rare Book Library at Emory University. The Rose Library is what we call a special collections library or an archive, so we collect things like letters, diaries, books, even personal computers. The Rose Library is focused on collecting material that relate to social, political events or happenings in the world.
So as an instruction archivist, what is your work in particular?
So I partner with faculty and students. Faculty might want to bring their students to the Rose Library to learn about a particular event that might have happened or a particular person that we might have their personal papers. And I help to facilitate that process by doing activities with the students and also talking to them about how to get started with their research projects.
Mm-hmm. So would you consider this being a form of public history?
Oh, definitely. I definitely think that we help to facilitate public history. We often have researchers of all kinds across the world that come to Rose Library because they want to learn something about something that might have happened in their community or something that they want to know more about. And Rose Library is often a repository that has documents and letters and maybe newspapers that might help them to illuminate whatever they might be researching at home.
Mm-hmm. So, for example, what kinds of projects can students or professors bring to your work?
Oh, so many different projects. This past semester, we had a class of students that were in the dance department, and we have currently an exhibition on building our African American collections, which is a major collecting area for Rose Library. And the students came to Rose Library to do research on African American collections and choreographed a dance performance based on the materials that they found. So that's sort of a very creative use of Rose Library, but we have sort of more average uses of Rose Library that would be students coming in to do a short research paper that might look at a particular figure like a writer or a doctor that might have been connected to the university, but also with a historic event that might have happened around Atlanta or in the United States in general.
And how do you train or how do you teach students or professors to gather materials like primary sources, evidence, artifacts to work in these projects?
Yeah, so it just really depends on what the project that they're working on, but I can imagine that there are certain questions that students and faculty might want to ask about what they're working on. There might be questions that they want to ask before they come into Rose Library to do that research. Maybe a question about what is the final product I want to have happen. So if you're doing a documentary, you might approach Rose Library very differently than if you are doing something for a family project, for instance. So if you're doing family research, you might want to learn about, okay, so who was my great-grandfather, who was my great-grandmother, who were the people that came before them. You might want to be very intimate with the materials and touch things that they might have signed, that type of thing. But if you're doing a documentary, you might want to gather as much material as you can from multiple perspectives, from every perspective that you can. So it really just depends on what the researcher is planning to do with the sources that they find in Rose Library.
So in the case of this Teach Out, we are aiming at people who are interested in discovering or exploring or understanding specific places. Could be a building, a street, a block, an entire neighborhood, or a series of organizations within a specific part of a city. What kinds of activities or what kinds of tips could you give us for cases like these, especially considering that not everyone has a wonderful, resourceful library at their disposal?
Yeah, so one of the things I will say is if someone does have a library like Rose Library at their disposal, it would be great to go there because there are archivists and librarians that are they're ready to help with your research. But if you can't, I think one of a really great sort of tool with public history that it allows you to talk to a neighbor, talk to a friend, talk to a grandparent, someone that might have been alive or have experiences with that particular historical site. And so talking to someone that's actually credible. But you often can find those people in your own community, and they might even have some photographs, some documents, letters, those type of things that they never thought were useful or important. So I think one of the first steps is really just having a conversation with someone about what you want to do and what's your project, and they might be able to connect you with other people. I think people are sort of an overlooked resource, but can be very helpful if you don't have a special collections library or an archive in your community.
I see. So it is as if many people are unsuspectedly sort of reservoirs of memory, memories of what happened. So the first step, you would say, is to identify those folks and engage in conversation with them.
Right.
And then once you start realizing that there are many stories and memories there to be recovered, what should people do?
I think people should also think about the multiple perspectives. So if you're talking to a neighbor, that neighbor is going to give you one perspective. So for instance, I'm thinking about a street here in Atlanta, Georgia, that's called Auburn Avenue. And so someone that might have lived in the 1950s or 1960s might have lived on the same street as Coretta Scott King and Dr. Martin Luther King, who were very active in the civil rights movement here in Atlanta. But if you think about someone today living on that same street, a tourist from Johannesburg, South Africa might have experienced that street very differently because they would go to the King Center or to the King Memorial site. So that experience would be different. Or even thinking about a student at Georgia State University. Georgia State has purchased a lot of property on Auburn Avenue, so they might just think of it as a part of campus. So there are different ways that the people could experience, have very different experiences with the same thing. So that street in Auburn Avenue can mean one thing to different people. And so as you're doing that research, I think it's really important to keep that different perspectives in mind, because you don't want to do a project just based off of one person's perspective. You want it to definitely be nuanced and thinking about what other voices can I bring here that can actually give you a more full and representative idea of this particular site.
So there are multiple voices, multiple interpretations, multiple experiences and narratives. How can people preserve those multiple voices?
So there, I think in many ways that they could do that. I think just by doing the research project is one way of preserving those voices and sort of those meanings around a particular site. But they could also think of tools like oral history interviews, where they're sitting down and having a conversation with someone in the same way that we're doing, but asking very pointed questions about, okay, if I have this Auburn Avenue, we'll use that again as an example, and grandmother, I know that you lived there in the 1950s, tell me about the experience. So actually having that person think back to a particular time in a particular place, I think can be a start. But also thinking about the ways that that place changes over time and meaning changes over time. So for your grandmother, that meaning in the 1950s could have been home. In the 1990s, it might have been, wow, there was a lot of construction around because of the King site and King Center. But today, your grandmother might have very different views about Auburn Avenue, for instance, and that you want to capture those things that are the changes over time. Yeah.
But would you record those interviews? Would you take notes?
Yeah, I think if you have permission, if you have permission from the person, I think recording those things, if you do have access to technology like a telephone, there are many great apps that you could use to actually record and then transcribe them later. Or if you only have traditional means of a pencil and paper, that's amazing as well. You are just jotting down some of the things that that person says. And if you have access to a library or to a newspaper, you might go and sort of check the things that that person has just told you, so that you can, not that you don't believe what they're saying, but everyone's memories of things can, again, be very different. So you're wanting to be able to do that research at a library and archive to sort of contextualize what they're saying.
Excellent. And since memory is such a malleable thing and changing thing, what kinds of artifacts or objects, not only voices and narratives, but things, objects, would you suggest people to consider when doing these kinds of research?
Yeah, I think photographs are amazing. Photographs are something that can tell you a lot. You know, they say that picture is worth 1,000 words. That is really true. And it can really sort of, it's a snapshot in time. So I think photographs are a really interesting way to approach a topic, and you're more than likely going to find a photograph around someone's house or that type of thing. If you have newspapers, newspapers are great because newspapers are sort of a in the moment or a primary source, a firsthand account. But even when you're looking at things like newspapers, you do want to be cognizant that the newspaper writer could have had a particular bias at the time, or they knew their audience was a certain person, so they're writing towards that audience. And I think with anything that someone finds, they want to definitely be mindful about audience and why this might have been written a certain way. Another source would be letters. If it's a site, and it's sort of a physical site, if there are architectural drawings or land deeds, those types of things would be great to have. And if it's a historical site that sort of has an official historical site where there have been laws or some type of thing that's enacted to make it a historical site, you might investigate, okay, are there any documents around that that might actually be helpful? It's really interesting too that we have in our collection things like buttons from rallies that will give you a very different feel than maybe an official flyer or an official newspaper account, because it really shows that immediacy of what was happening, that someone decided they wanted to make these buttons in a moment. And though it's not what we immediately think of as an official artifact like a newspaper or a photograph or a land deed, is just as valuable in understanding what happened at that site.
Yeah, because this Teach Out is organized around the question of what is progress? How do we measure progress in our lives, in society, in a city like Atlanta? One of the definitions of progress is, you know, constant change and improvement. What's the link between this idea of progress and the kinds of work that you do and the people with whom you connect do of recovering these strange materials and voices?
So I think progress can mean, so often in historical research, many voices have been left out. And so progress is actually showing that one site or one thing meant so many different things to different people. And I think for the work that we do, being able to amplify those different voices and realizing, hey, this means something very different than me, and actually being able to have those things preserved for future generations to show that not everyone thought the same thing or everything affected people in the same way, I think is sort of a beautiful way that the Rose Library presents progress to our researchers and to future generations.
Oh, fantastic. Many thanks for your wonderful conversation.
Great, thank you so much.
No, please, thank you.